Hello, welcome to Sinner Saint Sister. On Sinner Saint Sister, we might laugh or cry, we might get angry or motivated, we might grieve or celebrate, and sometimes all of those things can happen in the very same episode. We are a community of spiritual searchers who embrace Jesus' example of making a beeline to the hurting. Whether an episode is spiritual in nature, purely educational, or just for fun, my hope is that you finish the episode feeling hopeful. I hope you hear something today that lets you know you are loved and helps you love one another. Welcome to Sinner Saint Sister. Hello, sinners, saints, and sisters. It's been a while. The Sullivan household was really busy this summer, and it feels great to be back together again to bring you such an important episode to close out season 10. Dear Alana is a podcast about passion and zeal, sexuality and confusion, scrupulosity, mental illness, self-acceptance, and the price of fitting in. Alana Chen, a church girl, purposeful and eager, longed to please God and live a religious life. As the podcast unfolds in her carefully revealed journals, we are led into her struggles around reconciling her faith and her sexuality. In her quest to become a nun, she is led by trusted mentors and clergy to pursue conversion therapy. Ultimately, tragically, Alana died by suicide at the age of 24 after being hospitalized for depression. The story of Alana Chen is delicately told by Simon K. Fung, and he reveals so much of his own struggle trying to reconcile his sexuality with his faith. The storytelling, the music, the poetry, interviews, Dear Alana is a stunning piece of art. And as good works of art do, Dear Alana is also a conversation starter. It is my hope that everyone listens with open hearts and open minds as complicated relationships are explored between morality and identity, tolerance and celebration, sin and shame, and the love we feel in the way we express it. I've held out speaking publicly on how I feel about the ways some churches have fumbled with their treatment of the LGBTQ plus community. Part of that is out of a deep love for the church. I am loyal. But stories like Alana's, stories like Simon's, make standing idly by and waiting for better answers than the ones we're getting impossible for me. I have to say something. And we have to do better. Not saying so makes me feel complicit. I am not interested in debating or trying to change anyone's belief around the morality or immorality of homosexuality. However, I am wholeheartedly interested in what Jesus would have to say about religious people removing themselves from sin and pointing others down roads that lead to understandings of themselves that is anything more defining than beloved. How can we ever expect the world to know of a God who loves them if it is so difficult to try to find a church who even likes them? This feels like something we can gather around. A point of unity, regardless of our perfect agreement, regardless of what we might believe, treating people with the imago Dei dignity that they deserve. It can be a point of unity, and we have to do better. I finished episode 8 of Dear Alana 2 weeks ago. Please listen to the podcast. I finished the last episode and I knelt right where I was in my kitchen when the last song started, and I begged God for a better way. I don't have any answers, except begging that you please listen to what Simon K. Fung has created with Dear Alana Chen. I am so proud to introduce you. Simon, you
Hello.
are my new favorite artist.
Oh my God.
Actually, I can't decide if it's you or Alana. But you are such a master storyteller. You are thorough, you are concise, you're gentle, you're humble, you're reverent. And the way that you write and ponder and summarize, you have this commitment to connection. You are connected to your subject, and then you are connected to your audience, and then you connect your audience to your subject. And in doing all of that, you bring people together with just the right words. And it might be in something truly awful, like shame or loneliness or self-hatred, but you bring us all together. And when you do, there is something that happens in the midst of your storytelling that you don't even realize. Like, we're all kind of leaning in, we're all being drawn in. And then in the middle of it, you kind of sit back and take it in and realize that somewhere along the way, like, all the boundary lines have been erased and we're all just kind of there together. You, me, and her. And I am so, so grateful. I am so, so grateful that you're here. You have a podcast called Dear Alana, and it simply will not let me go. I'm so excited that you're here. Thank you so much.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for having me, and what incredibly powerful and kind words. I'm so glad you're listening and feeling that way. You know, you never know when you write or release something how it's going to be received,
Sure.
um and you know what you're describing, that sense of like being together on this story, is exactly what I was hoping
Yeah.
people would find themselves in. So thank you.
Yeah. Love is always a risk, and your love
Yeah,
is very, very clear. So before we get started, before we dive in, I like to ask guests to introduce themselves to our listeners, to our audience, by telling us a little bit about who and what you love.
oh my goodness, yeah. So well, my name is Simon, and I guess up until a year ago had been living in San Francisco in the Bay Area, and moved to Denver to work on this project and kind of upend my life. But I would say what I'm really loving right now is this kind of period in my life where I don't really have a plan. Um, I knew I needed to tell this story, and
Mm,
I knew I wanted to devote, devote my life to it, to tell it well.
hmm
But at the same time, it's kind of torpedoed in some ways uh, my life as I knew it. You know, geographically, my work. I'm not, working and employed. I basically just need to sleep right now. So
Oh,
I'd say like I'm kind of in this period of uh, of newness,
hmm
and I'm really really enjoying it. I'm really looking forward to spending time with my family here in Toronto, and yeah, I'd say I'm just enjoying this period of newness.
Yeah. What an adventure. Um, if you don't mind, do you also mind introducing us to Alana as best you can, and why you decided to tell her story with the commitment that you did?
Absolutely. So the podcast Dear Alana is centered around this young woman named Alana Chen, who at the age of 24 passed away by suicide. And her life was one that maybe a lot of your listeners will be familiar with. She was a church girl. She was someone who found a lot of her belonging and identity from a really young age, as a young teenager in the Catholic Church. She was this vibrant top student who was athletic and was sort of super smart, known around town for her commitment to service. She loved serving the homeless under the bridge in Boulder, where she was from, in Colorado. And she really just was this active, all very well-rounded kid. She comes from a family that's mixed race. Her father's Chinese and her mother's Italian and Puerto Rican. And so she had this really interesting upbringing in the suburbs of Colorado with three other siblings. And yeah, and I'd say her life in many ways was quite ordinary and resembled a lot of a lot of people's. But she did, in the course of her early teenage years, become really infatuated, is probably the best word, or really convicted and passionate about her faith, through her local parish, through some of her priests and mentors. And one of the unique things about her story is that she had this dream of becoming a nun. At the age of 14, she was introduced to nuns and their way of life, and writes a lot about this in her journals, which is one of the incredible artifacts that she left behind. She left behind 20 journals in her bedroom, which her parents later found. But um, that that is kind of the basis of, in a way, the setting of the story that I go into in Dear Alana.
Yeah. So she wrote like she knew how important her voice was going to be. And I can't remember who said that in the show, if it was a friend
Mm,
or a sister, but someone said that. And she did. She wrote and she wrote and she wrote. And there's this paragraph in one of her journals, which her dear, dear mother was so generous enough to let you read. And there was this paragraph that said something along the lines of that it was really hard to write for just herself. And in that sentence, you found some permission to tell her story with the carefulness and thoughtfulness that you did so intricately through these journals. And so, when I look at the two of you, you are such similar artists, if I may say so. And it is my sincere belief, Simon, excuse me, that she handpicked you to do this project. And I know that she is beaming with pride at the beautiful product that you have created. And I hope that you are beaming too. How do you feel? How do you feel about the finished product?
I would say I'm really proud of it. I mean, it was probably the hardest thing that I'd ever tried to do, and for many reasons, as people who begin to listen to it will probably be able to guess. Um, Obviously, the subject matter is sensitive and heavy and deep and rich. And I mean, it's and at the same time, there was this tremendous sense of responsibility that I felt
Mm-hmm.
towards telling a truthful story and honoring her legacy, um, while balancing the real work that needed to be done journalistically, even though I'm not a journalist, right? Around
Mm-hmm.
getting to the bottom of, to the extent that we can know what was going on in her life. And um, as you'd mentioned, there were so many details about her life. She left these 20 journals, over 1,200 pages, and there's so much that had to go into picking
Yeah.
what to share, right? There's limited amount of time in a podcast, even if it's eight episodes, to really get into her life. And so really just navigating some of those ethical dilemmas of like, what would be something that someone who may not actually, who's not here to give us permission to,
Yeah.
to share her work, her writing, which in many ways wasn't meant for public consumption to begin with. How do we balance? How do I find those elements that are essential to the story? How do I respect what should be what's actually really sensitive and private? But as you mentioned, one of the things that gave me, I would say, a little bit of consolation was reading in her own words several times where she writes about how she longs to be seen. She hopes
Mm-hmm.
someday someone will find some of this work, some of this writing, and that kind of tension between her sharing really private details alongside her desire, expressed desire to be seen and to be known through her words, was something that helped me navigate some of those thorny challenges.
Yeah.
Um, but I would say, like, that was the work going into making this, and then on top of that, there was the personal dilemma of deciding how much of my own story to share
Mm-hmm.
in making this. My original intention was not to be in it, right? It was really for me to just be this sort of detached storyteller. But the more I the more I was writing and editing this, and the more feedback I was getting along the way, it became clear that there were questions around, who is Simon? Like, why do we trust
Mm.
him?
Yeah.
Why should we listen to him? And um, and so that gave me gave me some nudges into sharing my own story, which I do get into in the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, to your first point about just how synchronous in many ways, or how many parallels there were in her story alongside mine. There are countless moments like that where I just felt like, okay, I this isn't just a passion project. This is
Mm-hmm.
something that feels guided.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I absolutely fell in love with the both of you. There were these moments where I so longed to just jump back in time with you and be like your fierce tomboy best friend that's probably even a kind of mean, like on that playground. Like I wanted to be there with you so badly. But you share, your fervor, your tenacity. I love the friendship of God that you found so early in life because of loneliness. I fell in love with your cousin. I fell in love with your precious dad. And then Alana and her fierce mom, her fierce best friend, the scrapbook they shared between them, how she signed her letters to God. Love you, girl. I mean, just there were so many things about her, so many things that you let us see. Her fashion projects, the music that she made. I wept.
Oh my gosh.
I wept. And I'm just enamored with you both. And it's through this clarity of you choosing which details to share that we get to know you both so well. So many times, Simon, in the recording of this project, you actually say the sentence, Alana is articulating something right now that I have never been able to put words to. That happened a couple of times. And so her story, I think, and maybe it's a question, made you look at your story with some fresh eyes. Was the making of this therapeutic at all?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that I realized is often we're a lot more empathetic and able to see more clearly things that happen outside of us to other people, right? To people around us, to our friends, to our family, to our loved ones, than we are when they're happening to us.
Yeah. And then extend kindness even.
Yeah, exactly. To extend kindness, compassion, a little bit of sympathy. We're often so hard on ourselves. And I think that's kind of where I was at when I began learning about Alana's story and digging deeper. I felt in many ways that I had moved on from a lot of these chapters in my life and that I had sort of quote unquote, resolved them or felt like I had them all figured out. But in reading Alana's words and seeing her wrestle with questions, in her juxtaposing ideas that she was receiving that felt confusing to her, I got permission to feel that way, right? I got permission to start to revisit some of my own, some of those similar experiences and to look at them with new eyes. And by seeing what was happening to her, seeing how on the outside she was one way and on the inside she felt this other way, I could totally relate. And I think that began a process of revisiting my own past.
Yeah. Yeah. And then wanting to nurture that in her and letting that be an indicator that it needs nurturing in you. That's just, I can't imagine. So every single person is hurting in one way or another. And my sincere hope, is that I would be able to comfortably and confidently invite anyone, everyone, without even knowing the journey that they're on or the specific hurt that they're carrying, but that I would be able to confidently invite them to my church and without reservation know that they would be bid welcome. That they would feel comfortable there, and that they would walk in and that they would know that they are in good company with fellow broken people, and that we could all sit together there in our simultaneous imperfection and trust in the Lord. And I don't even think that's like a controversial desire. I think that that's probably pretty universal, that any Christian, especially if you're modeling your lives after Jesus Christ, would say, yes, that is my hope, that everyone would feel comfortable in my church. I mean, clergy, everyone would raise their hands, all in favor. Yes. And yet we shoot and we miss. We miss the mark. And I'm not certain that we are missing that mark any more widely than we are with the LGBTQ plus community. And there are so many reasons for that. They're complex, they're nuanced. And I was wondering if it might be an obvious, maybe not easy, but obvious place to start in talking about language, our language around this. Our words matter because words help us understand ourselves and each other. And I thought that it was really interesting in the storytelling that Alana really embraces this title of same-sex attracted over, say, the word gay or homosexual, because in doing so, there was something for her that might have described her, but didn't necessarily define her. So it's like I'm experiencing this thing versus I am this thing. And you say something kind of funny in the podcast. It's like maybe having, I don't know what you say exactly, but it's like having alopecia or indigestion. It's like one might also have same-sex attraction. So what are your latest thoughts, Simon, on the language that we're using, and how do you think that language influences how we feel about homosexuality?
Yeah, so I think like Alana, I really embraced a lot of the language that the church gave me as a young person around putting words to my experience of sort of literally same-sex attraction, right? Like around being physically, emotionally, romantically interested in members of the same sex. And I think what's interesting is like, yeah, our language is imperfect, and depending on where we are, we do often code switch, right? We often try to use the language to signal that we're in with a particular group, that we believe certain assumptions about some of those words. And so I think about, for example, the heated language the passionate language that people use around being pro-life versus anti-abortion, right? Like often which word you choose signals a lot more than just your political position on a particular topic.
Absolutely.
And so I think that the word same-sex attraction versus, for example, the word gay or homosexual is similar in that for many Catholics, the word same-sex attraction is intentionally used in order to try to distance a person from identifying with that condition so that it feels a lot more like an attribute of them. Like I say in the podcast, like having psoriasis, right? Like, oh, I'm someone who struggles with psoriasis. I'm someone who struggles with same-sex attraction versus something that's much more defining, like I'm American or I'm, you know, Chinese. Like there's so many other that takes on sort of a more identifiable or deeper identity marker by using a word like gay or homosexual. So I'm sort of talking out loud on this. I do think also that what's interesting about these terms is, for me at least, the reason why I chose initially to identify the word same-sex attracted was because I didn't see myself as those other people who were gay, which in my mind meant they were politically active. They were these sorts of like gay rights activists who were trying to change all the laws, who were dancing in the pride parade. Like that wasn't my experience of my um, budding attractions and feelings. I didn't feel like that was my community or culture. And I've since talking to other folks in the years since my adolescence, I'm also learning that this is a country specific phenomenon where, for example, outside of the United States, terms like LGBTQ feel very political. They feel very strident. And whereas maybe here in the US, we feel a little bit more neutral about those words generally. Like they're just like, oh, they're Asian American, they're LGBTQ, they're African American. It's sort of another example of that here in the US, whereas outside of the US, it feels a little bit more like, oh, you are a political lobbyist, right? So I think like that as a background can really help us understand why people choose to identify with the words that they use.
Yeah.
And I'm all for people finding the word that fits them. For me, at least, what I have come to realize, especially in making Dear Alana, was one of the big reasons why I chose not to use the word gay or homosexual growing up was because of the shame that I felt deep down around this experience that I was having, right? This aspect of me. Um, and I think that oftentimes we in the church overlook the hidden relationship that people may have to some of these words and try to say things like, well, don't use this word because it doesn't define you, when in fact, what they're really saying is, or the way it's interpreted is often, I should not use this word because this part of me is so shameful and so dark and so damaging and it reflects such a damagedness in my own life that I need to distance myself from this part of me, and I need to actively feel, actively step away from any implication of this being an aspect of my identity. And I think that's one of the tragedies that often goes overlooked when we are dealing with this population of folks, is that we use words without knowing the ways in which they're received, without really understanding the layers underneath that word and why this word can actually perpetuate a shame that a person may still have about their identity. And I think that's really where the work needs to be done, because we can sort of like brush this topic aside and say, well, here's our pastoral approach. Here's the language we should be using, when in fact, we're not really addressing the root that people are really struggling with. That makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a neutrality, I guess, there's the attractiveness of the neutrality of same sex attracted. And I suppose it feels like we've come a long way, because it used to be a disease, right? I mean, as late as 1987, I think it was in the DSM as a disease. And so when that's the public consciousness around this concept, this idea, this attraction, of course you're fearful of it. If it's a disease, of course you want to stay away from it. If it's a disease, of course you want to cure it. If it's a disease. And then if it's something that you have, if this attraction, if this same-sex attraction, if it's only something that you have, then it's probably something that you can unhave, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I would add like a few things. One is like on the language front, and you may not want to use this part of the interview, but I did speak with the clinician researcher who coined the term conversion therapy. And one of the things that he told me about was how much he was struggling with finding a word to describe some of these treatments. And we'll get into that later, but as a parenthesis. But what he noticed was, historically, the way that a lot of these treatments were described was treatment, quote unquote, treatment of homosexuality, which, as you described, puts homosexuality or same-sex attraction under the category of a disease that needs to be treated, right? And so there's so much subtlety to the way we use language that can frame an experience as a pathology or not. And so he chose a different term to try to, change the way that this was framed. But the other thing I would add is that, like, as a young person, hearing the, studying very closely all of the pastoral direction that Orthodox Catholicism had to offer around folks struggling with these matters, I really bought into the message that, Simon, Alana, this is not a core part of your identity. this is not something that, by using other words like gay and homosexual, you are turning this into something that is an essential part of you, it describes the entirety of your being.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what's interesting is that if you actually talk to a person who's dealing with these matters, who's same-sex attracted or who's gay, I don't think a lot of them, even those who identify as gay, would see this topic or see this experience or condition as something that defines them. And you hear about that when I spoiler alert, share some of talk about some of this with my cousin, right?
Mm-hmm.
She doesn't see herself that way, but that's the way that many in the church would paint those in the LGBTQ community. And so there's, I think, a little bit of broken telephone going on, or a little bit of
Mm-hmm.
projection, where we're telling people what their experience is when in fact they're not actually experiencing that. Because if you think about it, we identify with all sorts of attributes that form parts of who we are, but I don't think anyone would ever perceive that they're all of who we are, right? Like, for example, I'm American, I'm Canadian, I have brown eyes. Like, there are attributes, or I'm trying to think of words that describe me. Like, I am an uncle, I am a brother. These are attributes of me, but they aren't me in my entirety. And I don't think we would apply that same standard to
Mm-hmm.
any other attribute. But for some reason, when it comes to sexuality and gender, we like to go to these sorts of extremes.
Yeah, interesting. So identity, the question of identity, it's like this ancient human concern. And certainly as Christians, we're interested in identity. Is identity something that we discover? Is it something that we create? Is it something that we, receive? And so I think the essence of the question is attraction, because you have this unsought experience of attraction. You're not trying to be attracted. That's not what attracted means. It just means that
Right.
I am attracted. And so how much do our attractions have to do with our identity? I mean, that's the question. How much of what I am attracted to, how much does that define me? How much does that definition determine my identity? So how important do you think our attractions are to understanding ourselves?
That's really interesting. I think attraction, and especially as it pertains to our sexuality and the way we experience attraction, is so messy and complicated.
Yeah.
And I think that in many ways we are only now beginning to develop more nuanced language
Mm-hmm.
around
Mm-hmm.
that, right? It's not just that, oh, I find this person hot, or, oh, I want to have children with this person, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's so many other, I think we're finding new words to describe what draws us to another person, or a group of people, and I think that, like, as you mentioned earlier, there is, um, like, identity is something that is both given to us. It's something that we don't choose. There are attributes of our identity that we are born into, right? Are the family that we're born into, genetically, how we present. Um, and then there are attributes of our identity, and I would add also to that first category, like spiritually, right? As
Mm-hmm.
babies,
Mm-hmm.
we receive our baptism, right? As
Yeah.
our part of our identity. But then
Yeah.
there are attributes of our identity that we kind of take on later on in life, or that we co-create, that we contribute to. It's sort of that
Mm-hmm.
mixing of both our nature as well as our environment, right? Like, if I have this inclination to be a writer or a designer, graphic designer, I may pursue that, and that becomes a part of my identity. The work that I do and
Mm-hmm.
how I choose to express myself in the world becomes a part of me. If I decide to, I don't know, father a child, right? That paternity takes on a
Mm-hmm.
concrete part of my identity.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's no clear answer there, but I would say that for many people, the experience of like effective romantic sexual attraction is something that's quite stable and
Mm-hmm.
persists, and is something that generally is not, I would say most of the time, is not something chosen. It's something that we discover in ourselves as we come of age, as we grow. And for some people, it happens earlier in life. For some people, it happens later in life. And I guess I would just put it in that first category as something that's a little bit more given.
Yeah. It's interesting because I feel like the argument becomes, well, my sexuality, my attractions is me. And if you reject that, then you reject me.
Right.
And the church's answer to that is, no. We don't reject you. We're just rejecting this part of you. And that part of you can deny. Or that part of you can disassociate from.
Right. The great word. Yes.
And so there's the crux, because I feel like, Simon, that Alana was receiving two messages at the same time from the same people that were very different. And so the first message, she was told over and over and over again that her attractions did not define her, and that she didn't have to identify with them. In other words, it was kind of no big deal. Like, this is just a thing. And then at the same time, by the same people, she was also sent to very certain counselors. She was also suggested, very specific retreats, websites, explaining all of the things that were making her feel this way, articles demystifying all of it. Essentially, she was told that she would have to be healed of this disorder in order to pursue a religious life or be a wife. And so on one hand, you have, hey, this is just a small part. Don't, I mean, literally, her spiritual advisor's words were, don't take yourself so seriously. Right. Okay. So that's what's happening over here. But then if you're going to work here, if you're going to be celebrated here, not tolerated, but celebrated, if you're going to pursue religious life, then these are the things that maybe you should go have figured out.
Yeah.
That should be healed. That should be healed. And so how in the world do we pastor with tenderness and teach with clarity and seek out the hurting when there is this huge mixed message coming from the church over and over and over again? Do you have advice for clergy? Do you have advice for people leading?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head that this is a really good example of the state of where we are as a church around like the best advice we can be giving young people and people in general on these matters. And it wasn't until I read that kind of juxtaposition in Alana's writing, like literally in the paragraph where she's like, they said it was no big deal. And then they also said that it was a heavy cross that, left untreated would essentially lead me to hell. And so there was this both kind of like dismissiveness about the advice alongside really, really heavy existential consequences to like one's eternal soul, right? So like, which is it? Like, this is like a really confusing thing to hold. And I think that what's so interesting is that I used to try to hold that tension too, and thought this was just one of those, like, the church likes to use the language of mystery or this sort of dialectical paradox, right? Like, oh, it's both and. I don't think this is one of those examples. I think this is an actual contradiction. Like, I think this is a square that you really can't circle, or circle you can't square. And I think it was reading Alana's confusion that really helped me see that more clearly in myself. And like, I understand the intentionality behind why pastoral counsel is the way it is here, where it may not want to encourage young people to give too much weight to some of their experiences that they believe could either be temporary and passing, right? Or they believe, probably with some outdated understanding and science, that, oh, the more you fixate or investigate or explore, the deeper you will get entrenched into this, and you will essentially become gay, even if you weren't to begin with. So there's this, I understand that desire to not fixate on this and to try to dismiss it. But at the same time, as you'd mentioned, there is this heaviness that's associated with going near this topic at all. And so yeah, I'd say for me at least, this is kind of what happens when you start with a perspective of like morality, first of all. And I think the church, when it comes to looking at the phenomenon of homosexuality, begins with natural law as its starting point. I mean, it starts with revelation, but I think many have since realized that any external prohibition around committed, lifelong, romantic partnership of people with the same sex is not exactly what was condemned in Leviticus and by St. Paul. And so I think that argument is starting to die out. But the one that remains is this natural law idea that, well, we need to evaluate this and understand people who have same-sex attraction or who are gay from this perspective of right and wrong. Like, first and foremost, like that's where we need to start on looking at people with this condition and who are experiencing this as part of their identity. And I just think that is kind of input output, like what you're going to get if you start there. You're going to get advice that's centered around behavior, that's centered around policing behavior, conforming, behavioral conformity, and I think that's what Alana and I got. It was very much, well, we need to steer you away from this. We're going to put you into therapy, and you're going to want to also seek out this kind of therapy on your own that is going to eliminate this quote unquote objective disorder about you. So I think that, I mean, I don't have a good solution. I think so much of what is happening is we are still discovering and learning about what it's like to be gay and what it's like to wrestle with this kind of pastoral advice. And unfortunately, there are real consequences to this, right? There are real casualties in our stumbling. And I think that's so much of the tragedy of Alana's story. And so for so many people who have many years of their life spent pursuing and following up on and actively, dutifully doing what the church advises them to do in these matters, is that the tragedy is that we miss out on hearing and walking with and really learning from people who are in the midst of these experiences. And that's what happens when you start with morality and moralistic approaches to catechesis and education. So yeah, I would say sort of like the alternative would be to find other angles, right? Other angles of accompaniment, as the Pope describes, other angles of listening. I do really believe that in the church, there are roughly two camps of people. There are those who believe that we've exhausted everything we already need to know about complex matters such as sexuality and relationship. And so all we need to do is essentially follow the quote unquote rules and conform. And that's what it means to be a good Catholic. And then there are those who I think believe that we've really only begun scratching the surface of these topics and that there's so much we don't know. And I think Alana's story invites us into that second category.
Yeah. Well said. Science and religion don't always play nicely. I feel like there's often a theological resistance to scientific assertions, but then there's also a scientific blind eye to mystical experiences of the religious, right? And so I have this dear friend who doesn't think this is a problem at all. He's like, it's just a natural part of the process. Science and religion marry up perfectly. It's just that science is faster than religion or than theology. And I was like, oh, I like that. That's interesting. And so scientifically, conversion therapies have largely been debunked, and therapists are very much trying to separate themselves from ever having practiced them. For example, Exodus International has been disbanded. They've admitted that there were false claims. Are there new conversion therapies on the horizon? What's new in this field? Or is there, or have we as a people determined that was malpractice?
Yeah, so I get into this in the podcast, which is some of the history behind conversion therapy and the kinds of theories that really inform conversion therapy, and a lot of it really begins with Freud around his theories around parental detachment and attachment being really formative in our adult development. And so that aside, I think what's interesting is that the new wave of practitioners of these approaches have sort of rebranded and have taken on some different language. So instead of focusing on conversion therapy as something prescribed by an outsider, whether that's a person, a clergy person or a parent, they focus on patient choice. They focus on the fact that this is chosen by people, and so we need to protect those rights. They focus on religious liberty arguments. They talk about how orientation change is no longer a primary outcome, but a secondary outcome. And so the primary outcome being we need to address your underlying childhood traumas. And we're just simply doing that. And as a consequence, you may experience orientation change. And then they also often will sort of bob between therapy and ministry. And so there are groups that historically would have put themselves in the category of conversion therapy or ex-gay ministry, but now we'll say, well, we don't actually practice or endorse conversion therapy because we're not therapists. So there's a constant kind of like shifting of this, but I think what all of it still has in common is this idea that what people are experiencing in their sexuality is pathological from a like psychological perspective, or broken from a spiritual perspective. I think those terms are fairly interchangeable. And I think what's also unique about this phenomenon of these kinds of approaches and therapies is that there are, like, the question around whether or not a person is making a free choice in seeking out them is really interesting to me. Like, when I began making this project, I always believed that this was my choice. And Alana writes about this as well. Like, this was her choice to choose this kind of therapy and to seek this kind of counsel. No one did it, so I really have no one to blame. But in the course of making it and speaking with folks and gathering feedback from people who were listening to me talk about my experiences, they were challenging it. They were like, Simon, did you really have a choice? Like, if the choice was between changing or facing like existential, like moral peril, like, is that actually a choice? Like, when there's essentially a gun to your head, right, around what you need to be doing to live a full life and to pursue your vocation. And so I was like, oh my goodness, like, I wonder if there's really actual choice and agency in a lot of folks' experience. But I do want to say, one of the reasons I tried to tell the story as accurately as I could in the way I did, and really getting into a lot of the theories. A lot of people, I got some feedback from folks saying, well, you're giving too much airtime to these messages. But I wanted to show them for what they were, because I do believe that they will always have an air of rationality or reasonableness behind them, because what a lot of these psychological theories do is they actually draw from real life experiences, right? They were able to reference me being bullied or my relationship with my father. And the difference is that they just tied it together into a narrative that served, its purpose around trying to explain my homosexuality. But because it's still drawing from a lot of these experiences, and mind you, me going to my first conversion therapist was also my first time in actual therapy, right? So it's like, wow, this is like, I'm like hearing from someone who's like listening to me, taking notes, who's actually asking me to talk about my childhood and upbringing. Like that was very, at some levels, therapeutic for me. And I think that's why a lot of people find it compelling and choose to spend years in these programs, is because they are getting, there is a kernel of truth in some senses in the approach, and there is some
Right.
amount of
Right.
like, addressing of issues in their lives. Um, but I think at least in my experience was, and also Alana's, is that it didn't actually have the intended outcome, and it actually
Yeah.
perpetuated a lot of deep-seated shame.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. If this question is to, I love boundaries. I love boundaries. So
Yeah.
just tell me when I'm trespassing, if you will. But what are your latest thoughts around your sexuality being tied to some of unresolved attachment issue, or some parenting failure, or masculinity deficit, or how do your current beliefs about your sexuality affect your form or desire to be repaired?
Yeah. So as I share in this show, I did reach a point where, after spending all of my 20s in different kinds of therapy and programs and ministries, I hit a wall. I felt like wasn't seeing the results that I wanted to see. Sure, I was getting some interesting insight about me and my dad, and having some interesting reflections on masculinity and how that was or wasn't developing in me in the ways that I wanted. Um, but it wasn't having the intended result of changing my orientation. And I think that's the case for a lot of people. I think, side note, there are people for whom, because of their background in a lot of conservative religious circles, where there is a mistrust of outside secular therapists, and where the only thing that's on offer is this kind of reparative or conversion therapy. There's a population of people that actually find it helpful in resolving some of these wounds in their lives, and for whom, because of their starting point, perhaps they are, more on the bisexual side of the spectrum,
Mhm.
are finding some coping strategies on how to
Yeah.
be in a mixed orientation marriage, or to be in
Mm.
that kind of relationship with an opposite sex partner. Um, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, my experience, Alana's experience. For us, like, we didn't see that change. And I think that had really a triple, like, dealt a triple blow, right?
Yeah.
There was already, like, the first blow was the shame of that we felt around having these attractions and being gay, right? The second blow came when we were told that this was caused by some trauma in your life, or some problem that Alana had with her mother, or I had with my father. And so there was a lot of shame around that in my life. Like, oh my God, I'm so
Mhm.
wounded, right? And
Mhm.
then finally, the third blow of shame was, this isn't working. I'm not changing. My orientation
Yeah.
isn't shifting. So I must be so darn damaged and so
Mhm.
darn broken that even this isn't working. And I think I saw myself as this very broken, damaged, inferior person for so long, as all of my friends were getting married, as people were moving on with their vocations, pursuing their lives. Like, I felt stuck and like I had no future. And I think a lot of LGBTQ folks feel that way. Um and so, yeah, I would say that, like, and I can return to that topic, but going back to your earlier question of like how how I see this, I think that this was a period in my life where I, in some ways, had to go through it. Like, I wasn't in a place where I was open to outside voices on the subject. I was seeking out therapists and priests who were telling me what I wanted to hear, who were telling me that, yes, this is something that is temporary, that you can be, quote unquote, healed or fixed from. And I took it all very seriously. And I do think that there's like a valid, like, place for looking at questions around masculinity and femininity and childhood trauma and relationships with parents. But I do feel like the promise and the tying together of these phenomena into a cohesive origin story narrative that explains why you are the way you are is as foolhardy as trying to. I'm not a big believer in horoscopes. Maybe some people are, but it essentially is. It's more akin to that than it is, or trying to reduce or explain a person to one aspect of them, whether that be their biology or their astrological sign. I think it's just sort of a reduction ultimately of a person.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, thank you. You say this sentence. It's kind of this gavel dropping moment where you say, "My quest for change in this area of my life had to end, or I would." And you feel the heaviness of that with you. I long for deep and constructive mutual engagement of science and religious belief so that we could come together, because I'm just holding out for better answers than the ones we're getting. And I really believe that I'd like to suggest to religious communities that science isn't a threat. But instead, it's something to celebrate. It's something to help inform us. And then I'd like to suggest to the scientific community that the religious operate with a commitment to truth that banishes fear. And so if we could just come together with some respect and some collaboration, I think we could clarify and then calmly get to better progress around all of it. But I do think it's going to take some cooperation. Last question before we just promote. Speaking of boundaries. So I am not a mental health professional, and this is just the, this was the core thing for me in listening to Dear Alana. And I'm not a mental health professional, but I felt rage. I felt rage about Alana not getting the help that she needed, or not soon enough. Because the truth is that really it was only clergy that knew the entirety of what she was dealing with. And she was specifically told, do not tell your parents. And so I can't imagine listening as a psychotherapist or a counselor or a psychiatrist and wanting to reach through their phone and go back in time. And I would imagine it was so maddening as a trained professional, because there were so many people that could have gotten her the help that she needed much, much sooner. And I have no desires to diagnose her at all, but certainly there was some depression and probably some anxiety and OCD. But with mental health, and this is my question to you, but with mental health and spirituality, there's a conceptual overlap there. And I think that happens a lot. There's definitely bi-directional influence. They bi-directionally influence each other, right? And so Bible and prayer, over medication and psychotherapy is not always the best treatment. And so this is a boundary issue to me. There were boundaries that were crossed. And so when we have dividing lines, when we have no trespassing signs, there are many reasons that we might cross them. It might be an overestimation of our own abilities and arrogance, an underestimation of someone else's abilities. Again, I suppose that's arrogance. It might be a desire for control. It might be an anxiety. There are probably lots of reasons that we cross boundaries when we shouldn't. But what's your take on that conceptual overlap, and where are the boundaries?
Yeah, I mean, I think this one's really tricky, right? For anyone who's ever worked in a helping profession. I mean, my mom was a nurse, right? Growing up, my sister's a school teacher. I think a lot of folks would share how their role as a person with some sort of social power in the lives of other people in the sort of helping context and service context is something that often does veer. It does cross into a gray area where it's not, I'm not just doing my job, teaching my kids math, right? I'm actually at some level on the front lines of their mental health as well, right?
Absolutely.
And so I think that line being fuzzy will always be there. I think so much of the so much of the tragedy again of learning about what happened to Alana is that, like as you mentioned, these lines were continuously crossed in very egregious ways, where actually a wall was built between Alana and her parents, and we see this almost happening like a slow train wreck, right, in slow motion, because it's like ideas around, yes, it's just ideas that are planted over time in her, theologically, socially, and in the context of spiritual direction. And so I guess my thought would be that folks, in general are pretty aware of this often, but as I often say, like it's all kind of fun and games until someone gets hurt, right? And I think that we have in this case someone getting really, really hurt fatally, and I think it's a wake up call for all of us to be a lot more vigilant to educate ourselves. A lot of these, my friends who are priests, a lot of them are not trained in these areas, right. And yet they are, their parishioners, their flock is being taught to open up about some of the most deep, vulnerable parts of their lives in the context of spiritual direction, in the context of confession. And what do you do with that? And I think this is, like you said, one of those areas where science and overall our understanding of psychology and how people work is something that can be very helpful in informing how we should be pastorally. But yes, I think the lines are blurry. I don't have really clear answers here other than to point to examples where we have failed people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, Simon, you are just a deep well of wisdom and kindness and generosity. And I'm so grateful. Can you please tell us how to support you, where to find you, what you might have coming up next, what you would like from us, how can we support you in this very brave endeavor?
Well, I would encourage everyone to check out the podcast, Dear Alana, by going to dearalana.com.
My birthday is September 9th, and that's what I'm asking for my birthday. I want everyone to go listen to all 8 episodes of Dear Alana.
Oh my God, amazing. So thank you so much for that. So that would be the first thing. So yeah, I would encourage folks to go to dearalana.com. You can also search for Dear Alana on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts. Please follow us on socials, rate and review the show. And as mentioned, share if you happen to like the podcast, or even if you don't. I hope it can be a conversation starter in your families and communities. So please share it with those important to you, and give it a listen.
Yeah. Thank you, Simon, for your very important work. You tell this story in a bold yet gentle way. You are searching, but you're grounded. You are reverent, but you're also demanding. And I am so grateful that you spoke to me the way that you did. I appreciate your candor, and I pray that you never, ever, ever quit creating. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much.
Hello, Beef.
Hi, Beefinator.
How's it going?
Oh, Beefy, I adore Simon.
I know. I knew you would.
He is so special. Okay, so after I listened to your conversation with him, I told you that I thought he was aggressively gentle. And we laughed about the oxymoron of that, but he really is. He's aggressively gentle.
Yeah.
Just such a kind soul and good communicator, thoughtful, wise, open, everything that we love.
This doesn't always happen, but I appreciated his art so much that it can sometimes become a little intimidating because you want to like them. So it's like, I love what you made. Am I going to like you? I mean, you hear all the time, like, don't meet your heroes. And he was so congruous. It was like what he made was so consistent with who he is. It was so awesome. It was a relief.
Yeah. He shared so much of himself and told so much of his own story.
Yeah.
Okay, but I did have a question. Do you think it's just me, or did you sense like a sense of hesitation? Like not in a storytelling of Dear Alana, but like in y'all's conversation. Like, well, I mean, that might not be the right word, but like maybe like nervousness or something.
Maybe what if that's what gentle is? Is that possible that like, you know, a part of gentleness is just being, because he's certainly careful. I think he's very, very careful. And here he is setting out to tell someone's story because it felt very important to him. And then in doing so, he starts telling his own story. And then me as a listener, like I'm listening and I agree that the whole thing's important. So I'm trying to shine a light on someone else telling someone else's story.
Right.
And I think all of us, Alana, Simon, me, you have an awareness. So I don't know that it's like hesitation or nervousness as much as it is awareness of how tied to this topic, like some church people can be with angst or nervousness or fear or things that aren't necessarily great. I think that it's not uncommon for some church people to have some knee-jerk reactions when it comes to loving people who are different than us.
Yeah. I mean, certain church people certainly want to argue about what's actually loving. I mean, that's for sure. Like, truth and love.
Right. So you start getting here's what I've noticed. I think that you start getting nitpicky about exactly what love is when you don't want to give it. Right.
Right. Well, you've seen that already, right? Like you barely posted anything on this and already seen that. Like when you were just telling people to listen to the podcast, Dear Alana.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe you don't want to get into that, but
no, that's okay.
I'm reminded of like that metaphor that talks something about elephants running off. It's like a metaphor about a tiny rider on a giant elephant. So the tiny rider represents your conscious thoughts and the elephant is your subconscious.
Yeah.
So the rider is like intellect and reasoning and the elephant is emotion and attachment. And the rider, our intellect and reason, is like doing its best to steer. Yeah. But the truth is the elephant, our emotions are stronger and can just like take off without permission. So I feel like there's so many people who just hear the words LGBTQ plus and like their elephants have taken off and they can't even, begin to apply their intellect and reasoning.
Right. Yeah.
Because I mean, it seems to me that what Simon's saying doesn't seem that controversial at all.
This is definitely, I think that's a perfect time to implore that metaphor because that's exactly what's happening. I think that people's elephants have taken off. I mean, so I don't mind talking about it at all. I posted a story. I said, hey, listen to this podcast. I think it's an important topic that's covered very beautifully and artfully and carefully. And then I posted a quote from Henry Nouwen that says, self-hatred is such an assault to the spiritual life because it goes directly against our lone identity as beloved. I think that's such a beautiful quote, by the way. And so all I did was post that and bam, here's the DM saying, I'm concerned that you're endorsing something against church teaching, and I am concerned that you don't have permission to be endorsing this.
And you said, excuse me, but loving yourself does not go against the church teaching, right?
Almost verbatim, beef. Yes. But I feel like, so let's get into that. I feel like Dear Alana was so simple in its message of, I need to learn how to love me as I am because trying to change me is killing me.
Beef, you're dying to get on your pro-life soapbox right now, aren't you?
Indeed. But then the message was also so simple in that way, but then complex in another way where it's like, we have to do better with the messages that we're sending, the tones that we're taking. We have to do better around kindness towards people that are different than us, and any message that is complicit in hurting someone else, we just need to be careful around all of that.
I mean, even the word disordered, right? Like, I thought a lot about that. That's the language that the church has settled on. And it has implications because if something's disordered, shouldn't it be ordered?
Right.
So it implies, people need to change, or, even other things that I've even said, hate the sin, love the sinner, or truth and love, when those types of things are said with overconfidence and, or they're said with certainty or arrogance, assumption, or if they're said while removing yourself from anything similar, it just conveys a lack of humility around someone else's experience.
Yes, someone else's experience. See, that's just it for me, because I feel like we have got to quit being the Holy Spirit for each other. Like, period, the end for me, because the truth is that, and I don't know, this might be uncomfortable or something, but I feel like what you are essentially doing is you are asking specifics about someone's sex life, right? Because no one would ever ask me about my sex life.
Right.
No one would make demands of me based on my sex life. No one would check in with me to make sure I'm doing that, or are you, practicing NFP, or saying that they're concerned for me about anything that might be happening in my bedroom. And so I think that those same people would trust me to take that up with the Lord, that would be between me and the Holy Spirit. And good for them. Good for them in that, because what you are doing is you're leaving my things up to me and the Lord, and you are treating me with dignity when you trust me and the Holy Spirit to do this work together, whatever that may be. And so I think that when we are demanding details of someone else's sex life, there is a lack of dignity involved in that line of questioning.
It's good. I like what you said. We have to quit being the Holy Spirit for one another. It's good.
Yeah. I think that it's very common, and I know that I can be like this in other topics. So I want to include myself in this message, but I think that church people, that we can be passionate, and I think that that's a good thing. I think that it is possible that when we are really passionate, that it can be conveyed, that passion can be conveyed rudely. It can be conveyed with overconfidence or too much certainty. I liked those words you said a second ago. But when we do that invasively, it is incongruent. When we do that rudely, it is incongruent with the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount. It is incongruent with the fruit of the Spirit. It is incongruent with the way of Jesus in general.
Yeah. I think like that zeal you're talking about, I think it's often like defensive in origin, right? It's like people protecting the church. But, the thing is, Jesus never asked us for that. He doesn't need our protecting. He's victorious. He just asked us to follow him. And he asked us to follow him. And where did he go? He went to the hurting people.
To the hurting people. Yes. To the hurting people. I love you, Beef. Thanks for getting in this with me. And thank you for loving Simon and loving Alana and loving the church. I'm glad to be
here with you.
It would be really hard to do all this without a Beefy. So thank you.
Right back at you. Love you.
Love you. That's it for season 10, Sinners, Saints, and Sisters. We will be back with more great guests and more hope-giving conversations in season 11. We already have many exciting things in the works. Until then, I hope that you can keep in touch on Instagram or TikTok or Threads or Forte Catholic, where I occasionally co-host. Please be sure to hit subscribe so that you don't miss a thing. Thanks a lot.
Today's show was a production of Allison Sullivan in conjunction with the Forte Catholic Podcast Network. For more great Catholic podcasts, head on over to fortecatholic.com/podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts.